Topping the news this Tuesday, California's Proposition 12 is taking center stage this morning at the U.S. Supreme Court. The High Court's ruling could have huge implications with how California can proceed with its own laws. Our Washington correspondent Cassie Simeon is outside the Supreme Court this morning ahead of today's oral arguments. Good morning, Cassie. Break down what's at stake here with this case.
Well, Giselle, this case isn't just about pork, though the National Pork Producers Council is the one bringing this case. This case, depending on the justice's decision, could have impacts on California's emission laws and other states' laws across the country.
Supported Proposition 12. The measure, also known as the Farm Animal Confinement Initiative, banned the sale of veal, pork, and eggs sold in the state from animals confined to areas that did not meet minimum space requirements. The rules even applied to farms out of state if they wanted to sell their products in California. The National Pork Producers Council sued the state's Food and Agriculture Secretary, Karen Ross, to block the measure.
There are a number of questions at stake. So can California voters decide how animals are treated who become products in their state? Can the state of California decide that this is important health and safety regulation that they want to support? And what happens if the state of California or any other state isn't allowed, if their voters or their government isn't allowed to make these decisions for themselves, just because it does have an impact on businesses elsewhere?
Kathy Hessler, Assistant Dean for the Animal Legal Education Initiative at the George Washington University, says this case is about more than how the sausage gets made. It's about the Commerce Clause, which prohibits unreasonable restrictions on the flow of products between states. She says if the Supreme Court rules against Prop 12, the implications could be far-reaching. For example, calling into question California's ability to establish its own emissions guidelines for vehicles sold in the state.
And if we're telling the state they don't have that right, and instead the industry, right, gets to decide how they do business and how governments and voters and consumers have to sort of deal with the consequences of the industry's decisions, that's not democracy.
Hessler also says it was a curious choice for the justices to hear this case after the court's landmark decision earlier this year ending the constitutional right to an abortion.
You have a really interesting moment when the Supreme Court had said in that case, well, we're going to leave it to the states to decide. And in this case, it seems like they might be interested in having taken this case so they could say exactly the opposite. No, you don't get to decide.
There's no federal law protecting animal welfare, according to Hessler, making this a case that will be closely watched as the court decides whether to uphold the voice of voters or the interests of the pork producers.
And Giselle, oral arguments start here at 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific. Not only will legal experts be watching this closely, but I'm sure California officials will be as well.
Yeah, and Cassie, how could this decision impact California's ability to implement protections for reproductive rights? It could have far-reaching implications, no?
Well, I mean, look at this as Prop 12 and Prop 1, which would codify abortion rights into California's Constitution. This is exactly what Kathy Hessler was talking about when saying it will be interesting to see how the court decides, because when they overturned Dobbs, they gave the right to decide whether an abortion should be legal or not back to the states. Now they're questioning whether or not states can implement its own laws. So we are really going to have to look at how the court decides on this case, whether or not they're going to validate voters or not, or bow down to, the industry.
And how quickly could the court decide this case? And do we have any insights as to why they chose this specific case?
Well, last fall term began in October as well, and the first decision came down at the end of October. So it could be a couple weeks or it could be months for us to get an answer as to how the court will decide on Proposition 12. As for why they took this case, it really is unclear, because I want to remind our viewers, Giselle, the Supreme Court doesn't have to take a case. So they chose this case specifically for some reason. Now, Prop 12 was upheld in lower courts, so it's not to say that the justices automatically don't agree with the lower courts, but there's something interesting to them there that they want to take a better look to make a decision for themselves.
All right, Cassie Simeon reporting to us live from the Supreme Court this morning. Thank you very much, Cassie. Carolyn?
All right, thank you.